Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see you all. I recognise all your faces. I probably don't know all your names, but thank you for being here. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm going to talk to you this evening about portraits of Irish men and women, and you'll see why that convoluted title. But I want to, to start, remind you about the genres of painting. Because, as I'm sure you know, there are 5 genres of painting, beginning with history painting, then portraiture, genre, landscape, and still life. And they come in that hierarchy of importance. So portraiture is fairly near the top in terms of importance in the history of painting. And of course, while we look at the images that you're going to see on the screens, we should think about the purposes of portraiture. And first and most obviously, of course, it's one of commemoration. But commemoration can happen in many ways, and it can be problematic in many ways. There's the commemoration of political public figures, and those are generally male, or certainly were in the time frame that I'm looking at. And these could be national figures, and part of this national commemoration also concerns the creation of myth or legend, the cult of celebrity, if you will. And these images were expected to be looked at for a very long time, but of course history changes our attitudes to those that are commemorated. Witness today the pulling down of many public statues, people once revered who are now reviled. And of course with paintings, and I'm limiting myself generally to paintings here, it's much, much easier to hide them away. And the vaults of museums all over the world are stuffed full of paintings of people once celebrated in their day and now forgotten or reviled. And there's also then personal remembrance, more the remembrance of the people the artists loved, who they were close to. And women are most often confined to this category, seeing as there weren't so many in the public sphere. The scope of this talk really will deal mostly, with a couple of exceptions, from the 18th and 19th centuries, which was when portraiture reached its height. And I look also at a couple of examples of other media, prints, miniatures. Photography, of course, came much later and democratized the whole process, but that's outside of the remit of this talk. Another question just to think about when you're looking at the subjects who've been chosen purposely to think about in this way is their identity, specifically their Irishness, because I've put in Irish women and men. Is it relevant at all? How do we define it? And does it apply to the artist or sitter, or both, or either? So in other words, if an Englishman paints a portrait of an Irish woman, is it an Irish picture? And vice versa, if you get my meaning. And then, of course, there is the imbalance between male and female subjects. There are vastly more men from this period depicted in painting than women. So that's why I've given you the roundabout title, because I have artificially altered that imbalance here, and I've included more women than men, just because I can. In the National Gallery of Ireland collection, in this period, of 400 portraits, only 10 were women. This painting is a case in point. It's a portrait of the novelist Sidney Owenson, known as Lady Morgan. It was bequeathed to the Irish nation in 1860, shortly after her death, but before the foundation of the National Gallery of Ireland. It had already been rejected by the Portrait Gallery in London, as she had only just died and they had a 10-year rule. So somebody had to be dead 10 years before their portrait could enter the collection. So the chairman thought it too recent and her fame too slight, not to mention his disregard for women novelists and his distaste for her books which were known as Irish histories. What was not deemed suitable for London was deemed eminently suitable for Dublin. don't forget there was the same administration in both places in those times. But it remained the only female portrait in the collection for many, many years. Born in Dublin, Sydney Owenson's father was an actor, and after her mother's death she went to work for a governess in a family in County Meath which encouraged her to write, and to read first and then to write. And she published a series of novels between 1802 and 1827, which she called the genuine Irish novel. She hoped it would spawn a literary tradition, in her words, based on national grievances and borne out by historic fact. Her best-known work is The Wild Irish Girl, and it sealed her reputation when it was published in 1806. I confess I haven't read it, but it is still in print and it's widely available, so I am going to. She entered the household of John Hamilton, the first Marquess of Abercorn, and there she married Sir Thomas Charles Morgan, philosopher and surgeon to the household, but she continued to write prolifically. Her themes were unusual ones for a woman writer: unhappy marriages, the love of nature, the lot of the poor, absentee landlords, and Irish politics. And this makes some people see her as a kind of proto-feminist or early nationalist. And she was the talk of her generation. Her travel book on Italy, which was published in 1821, was banned by the Pope and loved by Lord Byron. So immediately one wants to read it. She had other books called The Book of the Boudoir and Woman and Her Master. So I think she's ripe to be revisited. To be honest, I don't know very much about the artist, René Berton, except that he was a pupil of the much better-known French classicist Jacques-Louis David, and the neoclassicism is evident from the sitter's dress and the Empire-style chair on which she sits. Now, while you'd be forgiven for not recognising Sydney Owenson, and her name probably won't spring to your mind if you're asked to name an Irish writer, you will definitely recognise this subject in a painting which was commissioned by the Ulster Museum. At the time, in the early 70s, Heaney had already published 3 books of poetry, and he had won a fair bit of acclaim. And he must have liked the painting because he subsequently used it as a book cover. Now, the iconography in this picture is a little bit strange. The way the artist is seated very frontally, looking straight out, with this very strange background of laurel leaves and birds' heads. Heaney himself referred to it as the artist's phantasmagoria. And if you look closely, the poet is sitting, but there's no apparent chair. Now, I can't quite work out, is he sitting on a deep windowsill, or is it just a pictorial device, either to destabilize the painting in a way, or simply to avoid a clutter of legs under the table, which would be not very well resolved. It's questionable. What most interests me, though, for the purposes of our explorations of portraits here, and for this question of Irishness and identity, national identity, is the critical reaction to this picture. According to the renowned historian Dorothy Walker, and I quote her words, "It's a portrait of the besieged nationalist poet keeping at bay potential destroyers, British adulation, unionist resentment, and even the professional envy of poet colleagues." Wow. Fintan Cullen sees it a bit more calmly as a portrait of a rising Irish literary figure portrayed by an Irish artist during an era of growing confidence in the country's international potential. Now, he's referring to Ireland's, I presume he's referring to Ireland's recent entry into the then EU. and that the modernity of the picture somehow fits with European influences. Slightly smaller wow. Really, is it either of these things? Is it particularly Irish in any sense other than we know both our artist and sitter to be Irishmen? In the mid-1990s, a series of 13 portrait drawings of Heaney by Belfast artist Ross Wilson went on display at the National Portrait Gallery in London. And a member of the public asked why so many portraits of an Irish poet had been acquired by the gallery. The director, a man called Charles Saumarez Smith, answered that Heaney's nationality had never entered the discussion, but that he himself was, and again I quote, reasonably liberal about what constitutes a contribution to British national life, and by any standards, a great poet of the English language who has been Professor of Poetry at the University of Oxford can be said to qualify. Well, who could disagree with that? But there's something else to consider too. At a previous talk, the one I gave, which Carol mentioned on the Mona Lisa, I think it was, somebody asked a question whether a portrait is really about the sitter or about the artist. And it's a very good question, because it can be either or it can be both. And Edward Maguire, in his relatively short career, specialised in these kinds of literary portraits. His painting style was characterised by a very precise line and meticulous draftsmanship, as you can see in such details as the folds on the cloth and even the texture of the sweater and the trousers that Heaney is wearing. He believed in the idea of the artist as a craftsman based on technical skill. But there's also a kind of stylization at work in his painting that gives them a slightly surrealist feel. Here he focuses his gaze on the quiet, dignified presence of the poet. And he himself, Maguire, is remembered as being a very shy and uneasy character. So perhaps the qualities Dorothy Walker saw in the painting, the unease, came from the painter rather than the sitter. Heaney wrote a poem about the process, which might give us a little bit of a clue. This is just a stanza from it. Since Edward Maguire visited our house in the autumn of 1973, a basket full of chestnuts shines between us, one that he did not paint when he painted me, although it was what he thought he'd maybe use as a decoy or a coffer for the light he captured in the toe caps of my shoes. But it wasn't in the picture and is not. What's there is come back, especially for him. In oils and brushwork we are ratified, and the basket shines and the foxfire chestnuts gleamed, where he passed through, unburdened and dismayed. So I think Heaney, in the line, what's there is come back, especially for him. In oils and brushwork we are ratified, credits the success of this picture to Maguire. He sees it as an expression of the painter, and well he might, as a creator himself. Now, complete change of tone here. Here we are clearly addressing the role of portraiture, not just of commemoration of fame, but of aggrandizement. Charles Coote, the subject of this painting, was the MP for Cavan in the 1760s, and Lord Lieutenant for Cavan afterwards. He was made a Knight of the Order of the Bath for his efforts to stem rebellion in that county, and his titles included 1st Earl of Belmont, 1st Baronet Coote, Lord Coote, Baron of Collooney, and he was a Privy Councillor. And he wanted to show all of it in his portrait, which was exhibited at the RA in 1774. His emblem, the bird, the Coote bird, a pun on his name, appears on his helmet and on the banner which is draped beside him. And there's a great deal of drapery with columns and a great hall behind, bits of military equipment all around. He stands nonchalantly in a pose of studied languor. His costume is extremely flamboyant, with diamond shoe buckles. And he actually wears the plumed hat, which normally in portraiture would be placed on a table beside the sitter, for just a little touch of humility. But our Earl is not after humility here. It's a completely over-the-top, pompous representation of an Irish peer, and one wonders really if he's just trying a little too hard. I have to say I love it. It's in the collection of the National Gallery in Dublin, and it's just joyous to behold. Charles was educated in Geneva. He delivered his maiden speech to the Irish House of Commons in French. Imagine that. And he was known as the Hibernian seducer. One of his adventures involved getting a fake priest to form a marriage ceremony with a maidservant in order to seduce her. He challenged Lord Townshend, the former Lord Lieutenant, to a duel in London in 1773 and was wounded in the groin. Just 6 months before this picture started, and one wonders, is the positioning of the tassel relevant in this context? The Coote family were originally Cromwellian soldiers and settlers. The town of Coote Hill was founded by Charles's great-grandfather. And his nephew, also Thomas, built Bellamont House, which was designed by Sir Edward Lovett Pearce in the 1720s. This was left to Charles, and that's where the portrait hung alongside a pendant portrait of his wife, the Countess. She was Lady Emily Fitzgerald, daughter of the first Duke of Leinster. And they had 5 children, but then separated. And I'm not surprised, because in his will he recognised 6 illegitimate children by 4 separate mothers, although altogether he had 11 by 5 different women. On his death, his peerages became extinct, and the house was sold to Edward Smith, whose family remained there till 1984. I was doing a little lunchtime talk on this painting some years ago in the National Gallery of Ireland, and the house was for sale at the time, €7.5 million. I thought it would be lovely to buy the house and buy the picture, reunite them. The artist Joshua Reynolds came from relatively humble origins in Plymouth, the son of a church minister, and rose to be the principal society portrait painter in London in the 18th century, founder and president of the Royal Academy. In his travels in Italy, he became a lover of the antique style. And getting back to our genres of painting, he acknowledged that history painting was the highest of the genres, and justifiably so, but that there was no demand for it in Britain, because the British people with money would go on the grand tour and buy their history paintings from Italian artists. So it rather subjected the homegrown artists to rely on portraiture to earn a living. So his style sort of developed this grandeur of portraiture to marry the style of history painting with portraiture. So they were replete with classical drapery, antique costumes, attributes and symbols. He sought effect over likeness. He was also notorious for experimenting with his pigments. He would buy old masters on his travels in the continent and scrape them down to analyse the paint to see what he should be doing to get the effects, ruining the paintings in the course of his studies. All his experimentation led in his paintings to what are called fugitive colours, especially the reds. In other words, paints that flake and fade and don't stand up to time. So he earned the nickname Sir Sploshua on this account. And there are wonderful stories about him, sumptuous dinner parties in grand country houses in England, where the people are all sitting around dining, with the host's ancestors looking down on them from the walls, and they would watch as bits fell off their noses while they dined. Reynolds painted an estimated 2,000 portraits and was very rich and successful. He was a networker, a socialite, a manipulator of media, and a creator of the cult of celebrity. We tend to think of celebrity as something to do with the televisual age, but this talk will prove to you that people have been craving it for centuries. Hugh Douglas Hamilton, the painter of this next work, was born in Dublin, and in his 20s went to London, where he became very famous as a painter of portrait miniatures, a kind of a niche in the portrait market, and a very lucrative one, and he became very successful. And in his 40s he went to study and travel in Italy, spending 9 years in Rome and painting portraits of the grand tourists, the Milordi, as they were known. It was in Italy that he honed his very fine, smooth, neoclassical style with its finish and detail, returning to Dublin in 1792 and quickly becoming the chief society portraitist. He painted absolutely everyone who was anyone. You'll be familiar with the subject in this painting, I think, Frederick Harvey, the Earl Bishop, because of his house at Downhill, County Londonderry. King George III referred to him as that wicked prelate. He was a prominent churchman, a great traveller, patron and builder, but he got to the top by chance. He was a third son, and his father, when he died, Frederick was 13, his father left him £100 per annum, which for an aristocrat was quite poor. And it left him the choice of the army, the navy, the church, of the law as careers, and he chose the law. But on his marriage, he abandoned the law and became a clergyman. Not because he had an ounce of religion in him, but he saw it as a much easier lifestyle. He was ordained in 1755 and eventually became chaplain to King George III. Now, his next stroke of luck came when his brother Frederick was appointed Viceroy of Ireland. And though he never actually took up the position, he did manage to appoint Frederick to the bishopric of Cloyne in County Cork. And from then on, Frederick was on the move. Just 2 years later, the Bishop of Derry died, and he was appointed to succeed him. And he was enthroned in 1768. As a churchman, he was a reformer. He had radical views on religion, mostly, as I say, because he didn't have any religion. But he did help charities of the Church of Ireland and the Presbyterian and Catholic churches too, and was a great patron of public building works. He even welcomed John Wesley as a guest in his home. And through all of this, his income kept increasing. His eldest brother, George, who had inherited his father's title, his grandfather was the first Earl of Bristol. His eldest brother had no children, and Frederick plotted against a possible marriage for his second brother, Augustus. Meanwhile, his own family was growing. He had 5 children, and he had his eye on the inheritance. So when, in turn, Augustus died childless, Frederick became the 4th Earl of Bristol. So a really rare and lucky event for a third son who expected nothing beyond his £100 a year initially. So he had lands at Ickworth in Sussex. He had a house in St. James's Square in London. And his wealth doubled. But at this stage, he rowed with his wife and never spoke again for 30 years. Now, these places you will recognise. He discovered Downhill, which was church land, when he was exploring the north coast for geological study, and he built a villa there. A later addition was the Mussenden Temple, which still stands intact, though it's about to fall off the cliff any time now. Fridswide Mussenden, it was called after. She was a cousin once removed. He called her his chère cousine, and she lived at Larchfield in Hillsborough. Frederick, depending on the stories you read, was in love with her or maybe had a crush on her. But when she died in her 20s in 1785, he named his little temple after her. He and architect Michael Shanahan designed Downhill and filled it with antiquities, which he acquired from his many trips to the continent. They also planned a great house at Ickworth, but this was unfinished at the time of Frederick's death. You can see it finished there as it stands today. Part of it's a hotel, and above the drawing for another house they planned at Ballyscullion, which they did build but was later demolished. He made about 5 or 6 grand tours to all over the continent. He knew William Hamilton, the British ambassador to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in Naples, who was an expert and dealer in antiquities, and at the time Pompeii had just been discovered, so neoclassicism and volcanoes were all the rage. He even tried to buy the Temple of Vesta in Rome on one of his trips. And on one of these trips to Italy, Frederick met up with his daughter Mary and her daughter Caroline. This is the event we see depicted in this painting. Mary was separated from her husband, Lord Erne of Crom Castle, County Fermanagh. Meanwhile, his other daughter, Bess, was in Rome to hide the scandal of a pregnancy by the Duke of Devonshire. She was separated from her husband, Thomas Foster, from County Louth. Bess became involved in a ménage à trois with the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, and she had 2 sons by the Duke. And after the Duchess died, she married him. If you've seen the film The Duchess with Keira Knightley, this is all in there. She's the other woman in the story. His eldest son Jack was also there with his wife Elizabeth and 6-year-old daughter, but he spent his time trying to avoid his wife in order to carry on an affair. So this was a fairly typical Harvey family reunion. The following quote was attributed to Voltaire, whom they knew and met several times. When God created the human race, he created men, women, and Harveys. Now, there's a lovely little book which you can buy up at the North Coast there by Stephen Price on the Earl Bishop. But in his book, he calls this portrait contrived. And I wonder, does he mean by the poses or the symbolism? But I have always loved it. Again, it's in the National Gallery of Ireland, and I have known it for years, and I think it's charming. It's a very large portrait, so when you walk in, you see it, you can't miss it. And one of the reasons I love it is that grand tourists usually brought their sons on their continental trips, as Frederick did himself. They were there to receive an education, not just in the classics, but also what might be called a sentimental education too. But Frederick, to his credit, believed in the education of girls, and he is depicted here with his granddaughter Caroline. The scene takes place in the English garden at the Villa Borghese in Rome, created by the painter Jacob Moore. Villa Borghese then and now is an art gallery. It's an allegory of youth and old age in the contrasting figures of the young girl in white, the old man in black. His costume is very severe, all in black except for the gold buckles on his shoes. He was a prodigious spender, so obviously the money went on the gold buckles. To continue the illusion of youth and age, she points to the Ara Borghese, the altar of the 12 gods, to a goddess representing the seasons, and she points to spring, and she's also pointing with her other hand to her grandfather, presumably representing autumn or winter of old age. The temple of Aesculapius can be seen in the background, which had just been finished 3 years earlier, and at her feet we see her folder of drawings. And on the right here we see one of her drawings. Now, she later married James Stuart Wortley, 1st Baron Warncliffe, and she had 4 children. Now, she was never a professional painter. She wouldn't have been as a titled married lady. But she was a painter of landscape and figural studies. And her collections, her notebooks, are now in the Tate London collection. So she was considered quite a decent artist in her own right. You can see how I'm manipulating this as much as I can to get women in who maybe at the time wouldn't have been noticed. But these women were very much noticed. These are two of the leading actresses of the day. Dorothy Jordan, on the left there with the fabulous plumed hat, was born Dorothy Bland in London. She called herself Irish because it was in Dublin that she commenced her stage career, and the Dublin theatre scene at that time would have been very, very vibrant. At 16 years of age, she became her family's main wage earner after her father abandoned them for an Irish heiress. Though not considered a beauty, she had an expressive face, vivacity, strong legs, and apparently a strong voice, and apparently the best legs ever to grace the London stage. And she utilised these assets in the male roles, what were called breeches parts for women. Ironically, none of the many portraits of her show her legs. So here she's depicted playing the dashing Hippolyta, who disguises himself as an army officer to win his lover. She achieved great success in Drury Lane as Mrs. Jordan. Now, the name was made up, and the Jordan is said to derive from her having crossed the Irish Sea from Dublin to London, and Mrs. to cover up an illegitimate birth. At about this time, she caught the eye of the Duke of Clarence, the younger son of the king, and she became his mistress. There would have been more than a tinge of celebrity gossip when it was exhibited in the Royal Academy. The couple, strangely enough, lived openly together in Bushey House in London's Bushey Park, and they had 10 children. The Duke's father, King George III, died childless, as did his elder brother, George IV. And so by a fluke resembling that of Frederick Harvey, the Duke became King William IV. When that happened, he promptly abandoned Dorothy and their children, settling an annual allowance of $4,400 on her. Now, that's the equivalent today of $340,000, and I think most of us could probably live on it, but she couldn't. And there was a strict condition that she shouldn't return to the stage, but she did, and so the personal part of the allowance was removed, and she died impoverished in France, where she had fled to escape her creditors. Her portrait now hangs beside that of William IV in the National Portrait Gallery. So some justice had been done. I've made them the same size on purpose. Hers is much, much tinier, as you can imagine. John Hoppner, who painted it, was an English artist of German extraction, attended the RA, and loved landscape. But again, like many artists, portraits were more lucrative, and that's what he had to do. And especially prized were those portraits of his of women and children. He was a follower of Reynolds, as was Martin Arthur Shee, who painted this portrait of the Duke of Clarence. Another actress of the time, probably the most celebrated Irish actress of the 18th century, was Peg Woffington. She began life as an impoverished Dubliner, didn't we all, who, after her father died, was apprenticed to a tightrope walker, Madame Violante, but she soon progressed to acting in the Theatre Royal and Smock Alley theatres in Dublin, and from there, like Mrs. Jordan, onto the stage of Covent Garden and Drury Lane. She was involved professionally and romantically with the famous actor-manager David Garrick, and had several other lovers and liaisons, but never married. Now, there are over 80 portraits of Peg Woffington in paint and in print, including 2 versions of this one by John Lewis. And this one is interesting because John Lewis wasn't a famous painter at all. He was the scene painter in Smock Alley. And so you can see that the scenery behind her looks a bit like painted scenery from a stage set. She was also celebrated for her lovely legs, and like Mrs. Jordan, also performed in these breeches parts. This cross-dressing was deliberately set up to create a kind of erotic tension. And There was a ballad on the go at the time, and it went, "When first in petticoats you trod the stage, our sex with love you fired, your own with rage. In breeches next, so well you played the cheat, the pretty fellow and the rake complete. Each sex were then with different passions moved, the men grew envious and the women loved." The final image of Peg Woffington shows how she had advanced to a respectable old age. She very tragically collapsed while on stage performing Rosalind in Shakespeare's As You Like It, and took to her bed for her final years, writing her memoirs, which were very scandalous and titillating, apparently. But this picture of her shows that she had acquired just by the drapery and the sumptuousness and the fact that she was to be painted in death, like a very, very famous and significant person might be. That she had acquired wealth and reputation. She had on the way changed her religion from Catholic to Anglican for political reasons and respectability. And she wanted to die very much a respectable matriarch, far from the Dublin streets of her origins. Before I move on to my next subject, I want to just remind you of the lovely Charles Coote, because he and my next subject, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, were brothers-in-law. And it's hard to imagine, in a way, two very different paintings. In one way, the pictorial conventions are similar. We have the draped column, we have the three-quarter face view, we have the pose with the arm akimbo, all reliable portraiture tropes in a way. We have the name. In Coote's version, it's on the banner. In Lord Edward's, it's on the paper that's on the table beside him. And it gives his full title, showing the Right Honourable Lord Edward Fitzgerald Dublin, showing that it was while he was still sitting in Parliament representing County Kildare. But there are very clear differences too. Lord Edward Fitzgerald's cutaway blue coat and buff trousers are the uniform of the English Foxite opposition, the Whigs. He doesn't wear a wig, but he has his hair styled and cut short in the French manner. And then the swathe of red cloth and the red cravat is a nice pictorial link, but it also establishes his radical politics. Fitzgerald sat for Hamilton in 1796, and it took a while to complete, presumably because of his political activities at that time. He hadn't much time to sit for his portraiture. And indeed, it was copied in several versions. You can see from the painting to the miniature, for example, it's exactly the same pose. So there are several versions of this painting, and this is where we come into the idea of the making of a myth or an icon. The portrait was meant for his mother, and many copies were made after his death. Gradually, the green jacket and red cravat disappears in posthumous copies, and this is sort of cleaning up his rebellious edge and making him more palatable, less revolutionary. A cult of the personality grew up around him, and I think it's probably because he was so good looking. And he was reproduced in all different media, including prints and miniatures, and all of this hype went to create this idea of him, helped by Thomas More's biography published in the 1830s. The fourth Duke of Leinster gave this painting to the National Gallery of Ireland. Very helpfully, William Drennan mentions visiting Hugh Douglas Hamilton's studio in 1897 in his letter to his sister Martha McTeer. He also mentioned seeing this portrait of Lord Edward and two of his wife Pamela, his French wife Pamela, though these are now sadly lost. It was something of a hobby for the educated classes. to have their portraits painted, to visit artist studios, to discuss the portraits of their friends and the relative merits of the finished paintings. Drennan's own portrait was copied about this time because he was under pressure from John Walker of the Hibernian magazine to have an image for use in periodicals. In other words, to be made into a print that could be printed in newspapers. So rather than let Walker come up with something that he thought might be unflattering, he had this earlier picture copied for him. And it's a very strange painting, perhaps purposefully enigmatic. You can see on the table in front of him, there's a scallop shell, and it's inscribed in Greek lettering with the word Philippo, which may mean to Philip. Drennan had published a book, Letters of Orellana, where he imagines himself a slave addressing his fellow slaves on the need and desire for freedom. So the shell is thought to be a symbol of the new order, the prosperity of one generation growing out of the death of the preceding generation. But anybody who's studied Dutch art from the 17th century will know that a scallop shell can mean a host of different things, depending on how you see it. So it's perhaps one of these sort of educated games of the chattering classes to discuss this symbolism. For the less educated classes, images of famous personalities of the day were, of course, disseminated in print form. And I put in the miniature here as well of Lord Edward Fitzgerald because for personal remembrance, the miniature was very important. It was worn on the person, often made of the finest, most precious materials. This one of Lord Edward is painted in watercolour on ivory and often containing a lock of hair if the person was deceased. It's worth mentioning that Hugh Douglas Hamilton did not share the radical politics of his sitters. As I say, he painted whoever came to him, whoever paid him to be painted. In 1800, he wrote to the Italian artist Antonio Canova, and he wrote, "In this country at the moment we live quietly, but between me and you it is known that the French plan to invade, in which case the rebellion will be renewed. A hostile enemy will create a situation of war even more horrible than before, because the people here are full of revenge, and it is very troubling to me that they seem incapable of forgetting. If peace comes, I wait not without hope of returning to Italy." Of course, by the time that he wrote that, Lord Edward was dead, and in fact many of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion were dead, and all the hope and aspiration that went with that had been largely crushed. John B. Yeats, painter from Tullylish in County Down, studied law at Trinity College Dublin and married Susan Pollexfen from Sligo, and then abandoned the law to pursue painting to the financial distress of his family because it led to a very insecure life and income, even though, to judge by the number of extant paintings, he had no shortage of commissions. But his practice was so terribly, notoriously slow, and the number of sittings he required, that many paintings were left unfinished. Many of his subjects were public figures, members of the Contemporary Club founded in 1855 by Home Rule sympathisers to meet and discuss the political and literary issues of the day. It was a kind of visual art adjunct to the Celtic revival. But he also had 6 children, 3 boys, William, Jack and Robert, and 3 girls, Susan, Elizabeth and Jane. Susan and Elizabeth known as Lily and Lolly. And it's his daughters I want to look at now. You know all about W.B. Yeats. I had him in, but I took him out. Thomas Bodkin saw a combination of intimacy and dignity in Yeats's portraits. He could convey both likeness and insight, but he himself interestingly believed that the genius of portrait painting is largely a genius for friendship, At any rate, I am quite sure that the best portraits will be painted where the relation of the sitter and painter is one of friendship. So he had his daughters as a kind of captive audience, as it were, and so he painted them very beautifully, in my opinion. Elizabeth Lawley was born in London but spent long periods of her life in her grandparents' Merville, just outside Sligo, and Susan Mary, known as Lily, was born there. And they both attended the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art and shared their time between Dublin and London. While in London, Lawley began to publish journals, and both sisters attended the Chiswick School of Art with their better-known brother Jack. Lawley also taught art and was a kindergarten teacher too. And as part of the circle of William Morris, both girls learned the principles of the arts and crafts movement and brought those ideas to Ireland. Lawley learned printing with the Women's Printing Society, and Lily worked with Morris's daughter May in the embroidery section of Morris & Co. Back in Dublin, they joined forces with Evelyn Gleeson and founded the Doneamer Guild, which produced bookbinding, printed books, embroidery and weaving. Lawley worked in the printing press and Lily on her embroideries. And their first book was William B. Yeats' In the Seven Woods. That lasted until 1907, whereupon the two sisters founded the Coola Press with their brother and went on to publish 70 books, including 48 by William B. Yeats. The poet Susan Mitchell, in the middle there, was born in Carrick-on-Shannon to a middle-class family. Her father was a bank manager, but died when she was 6, and she went to Dublin to live with her aunts and be privately educated, later attending TCD. She became a supporter of Home Rule and befriended W.B. Yeats on a visit to Sligo, where he was visiting his grandparents, the Pollexfans. Now, she contracted TB, unfortunately, and it was when she was in London for treatment that she stayed with the Yeats family and became great friends with Lily, because they were both in very poor health. And of course this aided the purposes of John, because they couldn't refuse to sit from him. They were there in the house all day long, so he had born sitters. And back in Dublin, Susan Mitchell became a journalist writing for the Irish Homestead, and contributed essays, reviews, and comic verse. And she also wrote verses for the Coola Press. And there is a selection of their work. The Coola Press was noteworthy for producing all their printed material on hand printers. However, it was never very commercially viable because it was such an expensive process. Likewise, the embroidery enterprise produced very beautiful work for churches, but it never brought in very money. So the Yeats sisters never achieved the same levels of success as their more famous brothers, William and Jack. The words there of the Susan Mitchell poem are, "While we walk the world on its wide roads and narrow ways, and they pass by the countless shadowy groups of nights and days." Now, William Orpen was a painter from Stillorgan in South County Dublin, who trained in Dublin and at Slade in London. And his artistic influences were very, very many. Again, he became a socialite portrait painter in the manner of John Singer Sargent, who would have been the chief society portrait painter in London at the time. He painted what were called swagger portraits, very voluptuous, glamorous paintings for the very rich, the kind of thing that's very out of date now. He helped to promote Orpen and introduced him to his important contacts. Orpen married Grace Newstub, pictured here reading on Howth Hill, but he was notorious for his very many affairs, and they separated later. From 1902 to 1915, when both of these pictures were painted, he taught at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, and he was urging his pupils to follow modernism. Now, you can see that these are both in a very impressionistic style, which is what he would have meant by modernism at that time. French influences, basically. By the start of World War I, William Orpen was the most successful portrait painter in London and commanded huge prices. Among his pupils at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art was Grace Gifford. She was born to a Dublin family with a Catholic father and a Protestant mother, and so the girls were brought up in one religion and the boys in another. And she was taught by Orpen, who considered her one of his most gifted pupils and painted her several times, and then she went on to the Slade, and back in Dublin trying to establish herself as a cartoonist, publishing in journals and newspapers. Then at the opening of Scoil Éine in Ranelagh, she met Joseph Plunkett, brother-in-law of Thomas MacDonagh, who was married to her sister Muriel. And both of these men were to become leaders of the 1916 rebellion. Through him, she converted to Catholicism, and they planned to marry on Easter Sunday. Other events intervened, as we all know now. After the Rising, Pearse, Thomas Clark, and her brother-in-law, Thomas MacDonagh, were executed. When Grace heard that the same fate awaited her fiancé, she bought a ring, took along a priest, and managed to persuade the prison authorities to let her and Joseph Plunkett marry in Kilmainham Jail Chapel, not in the cell, as is the popular myth. On the 3rd of May, 1916, just hours before his execution. After his death, she devoted herself to nationalist politics. She was elected to the Sinn Féin executive in 1917. Her sister Muriel died, and she took care of her children for several years. And she was interned during the Civil War for 3 months, after which she returned to her work as an illustrator and cartoonist. But she had very little to live on until she received a pension from the Fianna Fáil government in 1932. For various legal reasons, she didn't inherit her husband's estate. His family challenged it. 3 books of her drawings were published during her lifetime, and she was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery with full military honours. And you'll know the story from the song Grace. If Brian had been here tonight, I'd have got him to sing it to you, written in 1985 by Frank and Sean O'Mara. But it's strange that she's remembered now for her politics. Actually, her association with politics rather even than her own activities, and certainly not for her art. I think her story is a very sad one. I think she had potential that was never discovered. And William Orpen's own potential, while he was very successful initially, did take a sudden and negative turn as well. We see here 3 self-portraits of Orpen as an artist in the mirror, and then as he was preparing to go off to war. Because the First World War caused a crisis of identity for Orpen. His pupil and studio assistant at the time, Sean Keating, left London to avoid the draft and urged Orpen to do likewise and return to Dublin. But Orpen really felt that he owed his living and his fame and everything he had achieved to Britain. And instead he chose to enlist as a war artist. He was commissioned to paint military portraits and then sent to the Western Front in 1917. Most war artists were sent to the front for a 3-week trip. He was allowed indefinite time and given an aide-de-camp and a driver. So those connections that he had formed earlier came very handy. You'll notice in his portraits, painters often paint themselves with their painting accoutrements, which we see in the first one where he's looking in the mirror, and in the one on the right, he's sketching in a pad. But there are also bottles. Alcoholism and drink was to be one of his curses in his life, and it wasn't aided at all by the sights he saw during the war in France. In 1917, he was in Arras and Thiepval in the aftermath of the Battle of the Somme, and the landscape was strewn with dead bodies and burial parties trying to identify and bury the dead. He was utterly shocked, and it caused him to begin to lose sympathy with the leaders of the war as he gained sympathy for the ordinary men fighting it. and the displaced civilians. I've picked out two of his portraits because they're specifically ones of Irish men to illustrate this point. Not named men, but particular individuals, so they are portraits, people that he would have met on his visits, and he depicted them very, very sensitively, I think you'll agree. The centre image is that awful dead Germans in a trench, and it's a shocking image, but one that he saw daily. He spent some time in hospital suffering from blood poisoning, and he was nursed by a Red Cross volunteer, Yvonne O'Bick, with whom he began a relationship. This painting of Yvonne, originally titled The Spy, because he made up this silly story about it. He had to give all of his work to the censor to pass. That is the censor, A.N. Lee. And he said that it depicted a woman who had been arrested as a German spy, and facing the firing squad had removed all her clothes to try and gain sympathy and escape. And when it was submitted to the censor, of course, he was reprimanded. Mata Hari had recently been executed, and this was just seen as not funny on Orpon's part. And he was told on his next visit home to remain in London, but he returned illegally to France, where he was challenged on why he was there in a mess hall, and to demonstrate his connections, he picked up the phone and invited General Haig for dinner, after which nobody ever said anything to him. By sheer coincidence, and it's gruesome coincidence, this man, A.N. Lee, who was the censor of paintings coming from the front, was the brigade major who had been sent to Dublin in 1916 to put down the rising, and the man who arranged the executions of the leaders, including Joseph Plunkett, Grace Gifford's husband. After the war, Orpon's pictures were exhibited in London and Manchester and in America. Very explicit images like these in the centre of death and destruction, which were not normally allowed to be shown by war artists. But again, he used his friendships. He went over the head of Lee to George MacDonagh, who was the head of military intelligence, and he was allowed to exhibit them. He donated all of these works, by the way, to the International or to the Imperial War Museum, where they still are and can be viewed. He returned to France for a second summer, but it resulted in complete physical and mental exhaustion. He was commissioned to paint 3 large paintings to commemorate the Paris Peace Treaty at the end of the war, the now infamous Versailles Treaty. He struggled with his feelings about how to represent the victory of the war. Here are 2 versions. The one on the left is the signing of the treaty with the delegates to the conference. But he did another version of this where he added in 2 ordinary soldiers, a Grenadier Guardsman and a man called Arthur Rhys Davis, who was an airman who he had met and painted his portrait, and then a few days later he had been shot down and killed. Then he thought that might be distasteful, and he removed those figures and added just 2 unidentifiable, emaciated men in uniform with cherubs holding a banner above them. This version was exhibited at the RA, and it brought critical abuse but public acclaim. He received letters from dead servicemen's families congratulating him. And did Orpon, I wonder, contribute to the feeling of war as useless and unnecessary in those post-war days? Certainly the Imperial War Museum did not want that version of the painting. So Orpon changed it again to this version on the right-hand side. He removed all the figures and just placed the flag-draped coffin at the centre. This was acceptable to the museum. And although there are no people in it, it is a kind of portrait nevertheless, a portrait of absence rather than of presence. After the war, he continued painting society portraits, lived in London and Paris. He was still married to Grace, whose picture we saw earlier, And eventually Yvonne left him and married his chauffeur. His memoir, An Onlooker in France, was published in 1921. And he died in 1931 and was largely forgotten after his death until a major retrospective in 1978 and another in 2005 in Dublin and London. I'm conscious that I'm going over time, so I can stop there and leave it if you feel you've had enough, or I can just finish out the last few. Go ahead, okay. Because I'm sure you want to know about John Lavery, because he's a native son of this town. Born in Belfast and raised in Moira, he studied art in Glasgow, London and Paris, and his break came when he was commissioned to paint a picture of the visit of Queen Victoria to Scotland in 1888. He subsequently made his career as a painter in London and principally as a painter of portraits. He too was appointed as a World War I artist, but bad health prevented his going to the front, working instead with the Royal Navy shoreside. After the war, he was knighted and elected to the RA, and he was also members of academies in Ireland, Scotland, Rome, Antwerp, Milan, Brussels, and Stockholm. So how did the poor wee orphan from Belfast, as he called himself, achieve all this? Well, one of the reasons, undoubtedly, was his wife. His first wife, Kathleen McDermott, who was his model, her real name was Annie Evans from Wales, died after the birth of their daughter Eileen, and he subsequently married Hazel Martin. Lavery painted over 400 portraits of Hazel. She was born in Chicago to a wealthy industrialist of Irish descent and was referred to as the most beautiful girl in the Midwest. After the tragic death of her sister, Dorothy, from anorexia, she left America amid press slander claiming she had abandoned Dorothy, and she married Edward Livingston Trudeau. But he died just 5 months afterwards, and their daughter Alice was born after his death. Actually, her mother had forced her or persuaded her to marry Trudeau. And when he died, she was left pretty penniless and pregnant. She continued to visit France with her mother on sketching holidays. She was quite an accomplished amateur artist, and there she met John Lavery. Her mother didn't approve of the relationship, so they only married after her mother's death, when John was 53 and Hazel was 29. And soon after their marriage, they travelled to Tangier in Morocco to paint in the Southern Light, where this painting was made of her sketching. And you can see it's quite like the Orpan in that very influence of very light impressionist style. She was a painter and printmaker in her own right and did exhibit work. As you can see, this portrait of John was by her, but Hazel knew her skills and she knew her role, and her main role was as muse, organizer, and style icon. As I say, he painted over 400 portraits of her, and they had a very palatial home at Cromwell Place in South Kensington, a place where famously they hosted the Irish delegation to the treaty negotiations in 1921. And Hazel had an idea for John Lavery to paint the delegation. This never came about, but they did manage to retain very close friendships on both sides of the political divide. Now, the Laverys, it had to be said, they were the Harry and Meghan of their day. They were superb self-publicists. Influencers, they might be called today, in fashion and interiors. Their home featured in Tatler, in the Illustrated London News, the Ladies' Pictorial magazine. She created her own clothes with the help of a local seamstress. She advertised Pond's Cream and Armstrong Sudeley motors. Between them, they embarked on the systematic creation of an icon, helped by her naturally beautiful good looks and style and conversational ability, and so forth. Hazel attended fancy dress balls, tableaux vivants. Those were these strange things they did at that time where people reenacted a painting in the costume of the painting, but with live figures, and you stood there for a few minutes, I suppose, and were photographed. She was loved by photographer Cecil Beaton and Otto Hoppe. She acted in Hoppe's private theatre group, the Plough Theatre Club, and even in films such as D.W. Griffith's Hearts of the World, as a nurse filmed in France. And they were friends of the Asquiths, the Prime Minister and his wife. But John was also, open to a chance. This portrait, The Red Rose, has a very peculiar history. It started life as a portrait of Constance Burrell, the wife of William Burrell of Glasgow, now the Burrell Collection, that wonderful house and art. Then in 1912, it became a portrait of Sarah Bernhardt. And then, subsequently, in the 1920s, it became a portrait of Viscountess Curzon, and finally settling on Hazel. Now, it's intriguing to know, and I don't know whether it was unsuccessful in the first 3 attempts, or it was unwanted, or it was unpaid for, or why he held on to it for so long, or simply because he just liked the look of his wife so much, and she was really beautiful. He even painted her on her deathbed. And he was known to look at a painting and say, off with her head and on with hers. Politically also they were a phenomenon. After the 1916 rebellion, he retained nationalist and loyalist sympathies. He painted Catholic and Protestant church leaders. He painted Roger Casement's trial, despite press controversy. He gave aid to the family of the 1916 volunteers. He visited Belfast and lunched with the Unionist Lord Mayor and attended a function with the Orange Order. And he stayed at the Viceregal Lodge in Dublin with the Lord Lieutenant. This, I think, is the most ambitious and social climbing of all his portraits of Hazel. The artist's studio has been a typical subject for artists since Courbet, Whitler, Fontaine-Latour, and especially Velázquez, Las Mañinas, you'll all be familiar with, where Velázquez paints the court with the king and the queen in the background and himself as painter. Lavery reworked this several times. Initially, in the painting on the left, he had Hazel, Eileen, and Alice, the maidservant who was Aida from Morocco, and he had 3 additional male figures. He removed the male figures and he inserted himself. Can you see that the reflection of himself is in the mirror in the far left distance? And this was a reference to Velázquez. It's a little bit of a trick on the art of looking at a painting. The dog is called Rodney Stone, by the way, after Arthur Conan Doyle hero. And on the easel, there's a sketch of Queen Mary. Now, for the portrait of the royal family, he began with individual head studies. So this is one of those. And he painted those in the White Drawing Room in Buckingham Palace. And in April 1913, the King and Queen visited the Lavery studios. You can imagine the car drawing up outside and the King and Queen stepping out. This was the apogee of their social climbing. And the King was invited, following a story with Velázquez, that the King wanted to put his mark on the painting and Velázquez handed him the brush. Likewise, Lavery said to King George, would you like to paint a bit? And apparently he painted a bit of the blue ribbon that the Queen wears. So this is, I think, the ultimate self-promotion. He paints his own family in this grand style, in this grand house that he owns. And he's commissioned to paint the royal family, and then he reworks his own family in the image of the royal family. It's the ultimate kind of self-promotion, making that comparison. He also painted very many political portraits, and among them Edward Carson and John Redmond, opponents on the subject of Home Rule. They were intended to be shown together in a Dublin gallery. Redmond quipped, "I've always had an idea that Carson and I might someday be hanged side by side in Dublin." And Carson, not to be outdone, who thought the portrait of Redmond was better than his own, quipped, "It's easy to see which side you're on," to Lavery. Now, I wonder, is that a joke about the relative quality of the paintings, or is it a joke about Lavery's apparent political even-handedness? Because I don't think anybody in history has ever been able to maintain this even-handedness. Lavery himself, I think, possibly was sincere. He said, "This was my first attempt to bind up the contending forces in the bonds of holy paint." So was he naive, or was this his sincere hope for Irish politics? During 1919, during the War of Independence, they continued to visit Ireland. Winston Churchill, whom Hazel taught to paint, had asked Lavery for an assessment of the Irish situation, and he wrote to him and he said, "You asked me the other day what I thought of my country's state, and I had not the courage to tell you. But if one artist can speak to another, I will give you my beliefs. I believe that Ireland will never be governed by Westminster, the Vatican, or Ulster without continuous bloodshed. I also believe the removal of its castle and all its works, leaving Irishmen to settle their own affairs, is the only solution left. I am convinced with the knowledge I possess of my countrymen that such a situation would make her one of our staunchest allies instead of an avowed enemy for all time. Love is stronger than hate." If only it were so, if only he was right. Even during the Civil War, they continued to visit Dublin. Here's something I haven't told Chris. They dined with Michael Collins in the Royal Marine Hotel in Dunleary, and that night a sniper was caught in the grounds. And I'm just wondering, was it a Hudson? Likely. When Collins eventually was shot and killed in Cork, Hazel was distraught, and there has always been a rumour of a love affair between the two, but most biographers think not. I think that's based on the fact that he had a letter in his pocket from Hazel at the time, and it's now a very romantic, blood-stained letter with her handwriting. But most of her biographers think that that is unlikely. I'll finish with this image of Hazel. When the new Fianna Fáil government came to power in 1927, Hazel was disillusioned, but it wasn't long before there was another opportunity. Lavery had painted her in the guise of Kathleen Ní Houlihan, the allegorical figure of Ireland described by W.B. Yeats. And Thomas Bodkin, who was director of the National Gallery at the time, it was his idea to use this portrait of Hazel for the banknotes of the new state. And it was used, and it was there from 1928 until 1975. So the banknote design, the printed version, was taken from Lavery's painting. But just in case anyone didn't get the connection that it was her, Hazel put out a press photo of herself in the same pose. I'm not absolutely sure that it's this one. This one is by Hoppe, but pretty likely that that's the one. In 1929, Lavery made a donation of large numbers of pictures both to the Ulster Museum and to the National Gallery of Ireland. Again, his even-handedness. they didn't go to the National Gallery of Ireland, they went to the Hugh Lane Gallery in Hazel's honour after her death in 1935. He was the first Catholic and first artist made a Freeman of Belfast in 1930. He had an honorary degree from Queen's, an honorary degree from Trinity, and was made a Freeman of Dublin. So an extraordinary man and an extraordinary woman. And I hope you can see from these few examples that I've shown you that, as I say, celebrity is not a modern thing. It's been around for a long time and has been craven for a long time by the rich and the famous, aided and abetted by their portrait painters. And thank you for listening to me. I've gone way over time, so thank you very much.